The sound wasn't meant for me. I knew that the second I heard my name spoken in a tone I'd never heard before. My hand froze in midair, and my whole body went cold, like I had just stepped into a truth I wasn't supposed to see. Nothing in my family ever felt the same after that moment. Before I continue, if stories that slowly uncover hidden truths and quiet betrayals speak to you, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Some stories need to be followed all the way to the end to truly make sense. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that feels so normal you never expect it to split your life into. I was home alone, finishing homework at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in that familiar way that usually made me feel safe. The family phone sat on the counter nearby, the one everyone used when their own phones were charging or misplaced. It buzzed softly. Not a ring, not a notification, just a subtle sound, like someone had tapped the screen by accident. At first, I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. I looked up, annoyed more than curious, and walked over to silence it. The screen was lit, showing a call interface that hadn't disconnected properly. Someone had been talking, and the speaker was still on. I was about to hang up when I heard a voice. Not a stranger's voice. Someone from my family. They were speaking calmly, almost casually, like they had no idea anyone else could hear them. And then they said my name. Not the way you say someone's name when you're calling for them. Not even the way you say it when you're annoyed. It was the way you say a name when you think the person isn't listening. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at the phone as if it had suddenly become dangerous. The voice continued, explaining something to the person on the other end of the line. It wasn't a confession. Not yet. It was worse than that. It was planning. Quiet, careful planning that had clearly been happening long before that moment. They'd talked about me like I was a problem that needed managing, like a variable that could ruin things if left unchecked. They spoke about choices they had already made on my behalf, decisions I didn't even know were being discussed. My fingers curled into my palm. My chest felt tight. I finally realized this wasn't a recorded message. This wasn't something saved or sent. This was a live call that had accidentally been left open. Someone in my own family was speaking freely, assuming privacy, never imagining I was standing 10 feet away hearing everything. The call ended abruptly. The screen went dark. The silence afterward was so loud it hurt. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just stood there, replaying every word in my head, trying to make sense of what I had just learned. Pieces of the past few months started rearranging themselves. Strange comments, sudden rules, the way certain relatives looked at me when they thought I wasn't paying attention. It all lined up too perfectly. That night, when my family came home, everything looked the same greetings, the same routine. Dinner tasted normal. Conversations stayed shallow. No one acted guilty. No one checked my face for signs that I knew. And that's when I understood something important. They didn't know they'd been heard. For the first time in my life, I had information no one else realized I had. And with it came a choice. I could confront them and watch the truth twist into excuses. Or I could stay quiet and let them continue believing their version of reality was intact. I chose silence. Over the next few days, I watched more closely than ever. I listened to how plans were discussed around me, but never with me. I noticed how one family member suddenly became overly interested in my schoolwork, asking casual questions that felt anything but casual. Another would start making comments about my future, framed as jokes, but always steering in the same direction. They spoke as if decisions had already been made, as if my role had been assigned and finalized somewhere I hadn't been invited. I kept reminding myself not to react. That was the hardest part. There were moments when I wanted to shout, to ask why everyone suddenly felt entitled to shape my life without my voice. But the memory of that voice message stopped me. The calm certainty in their tone told me that confrontation would only push things underground. Whatever they were planning relied on me staying exactly where I was, visible, predictable, and silent. So I stayed silent. At school, things felt different too. I started noticing how often teachers mentioned family involvement when discussing opportunities, how certain programs required approval, signatures, conversations with parents or guardians. It hit me then that whatever was being planned at home could reach into my life far beyond those walls. One afternoon, I overheard another piece of it by accident. I had come home earlier than usual and heard voices in the living room. I froze in the hallway, heart pounding, already knowing I shouldn't be listening, but unable to stop myself. My name came up again, followed by words like timing, risk, and keeping things quiet. They weren't worried about hurting me. They were worried about being exposed. That realization settled deep in my chest. This wasn't misguided protection. This wasn't concern. It was control. And the people involved weren't panicking because something might go wrong. They were confident because they believed I didn't know. That confidence became my advantage. I began to change small things about myself, slowly and carefully. I asked more questions at school, but not at home. I volunteered for projects that required independent work. I spoke more with counselors and teachers, framing everything as curiosity, never suspicion. I learned how systems worked, how decisions were documented, and who needed to be informed when changes were made. All of it was quiet. All of it looked harmless. At home, I stayed compliant. When rules tightened, I followed them. When opinions were dismissed, I nodded. The more agreeable I became, the more relaxed everyone else seemed. They started talking more openly again, assuming the danger had passed. That was when I heard the name of another person involved, someone I trusted. The betrayal didn't come like a punch. It came like a slow ache. This person had always acted supportive, always spoken to me kindly. I realized now that kindness had been a mask. They were part of the discussions, part of the planning, part of the decision to keep me in the dark. I went to my room that night and sat on my bed for a long time, staring at the wall. Not crying, just processing. Trust doesn't break loudly. It fractures quietly, leaving sharp edges everywhere. I understood then that this wasn't about one conversation or one mistake. It was a network of choices, all connected, all designed to limit me while pretending to protect me. And I also understood something else. They had underestimated me. The next step came unexpectedly. A meeting was mentioned, nothing official, just a casual comment about sorting things out soon. My name wasn't included in the plan. I wasn't meant to be there. But I knew enough now to realize that meeting would lock everything into place. I needed to act before that happened. Not with anger, not with exposure, but with precision. The following day at school, I asked for a private conversation with a counselor I trusted. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't share the voice message. I simply explained that decisions about my future were being discussed without my involvement, and that I felt something important was being hidden from me. I watched their expression carefully. Concern replaced politeness. They asked questions, gentle ones. They explained my rights, the importance of transparency, and how certain processes couldn't move forward without my awareness. They didn't promise anything dramatic. They didn't take sides, but they listened. That night at home, I noticed tension I hadn't seen before. Conversations were shorter. Eye contact was avoided. Someone must have sensed a shift, even if they didn't know why. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. I went to bed night knowing something had changed. The balance they thought they controlled was slipping, even if they hadn't realized it yet. And for the first time since hearing that message, I felt calm, because the truth was no longer just something I carried alone. And once the truth starts moving, it doesn't stop quietly. By the end of that week, the meeting everyone had been preparing for was suddenly postponed. Excuses were made, schedules didn't line up. I could feel the uncertainty growing. They were losing control, and I was finally stepping into mine. But I also knew this was only the beginning, because when people realize their secrets are at risk, they don't always retreat. Sometimes they double down. And I was about to see exactly how far they were willing to go. And when they doubled down, they did it quietly, the same way they had done everything else. The atmosphere in the house shifted again, but this time it wasn't relaxed confidence, it was controlled tension. Smiles felt practiced. Conversations stopped the moment I entered a room, then resumed with exaggerated normalcy once I sat down. No one said anything directly, yet everything felt carefully managed, like a stage play where I was present but not meant to understand the script. I kept playing my role. I went to school, came home on time, followed every rule. On the surface, I was still the same person they thought they knew. Inside, though, I was tracking every change, every glance, every sudden kindness that felt out of place. The person whose name I had overheard, the one I trusted, started checking in on me more often. They asked how I was feeling, whether school was stressful, whether I felt overwhelmed. Their tone was gentle, but I could hear the question underneath all of it. Do you suspect anything? I gave them nothing. At the same time, I continued quietly building my understanding. The counselor at school became a steady presence. We didn't meet every day, and we didn't frame it as a problem. We talked about options, about independence, about what involvement was appropriate at different stages of life. Each conversation gave me a little more clarity, a little more grounding. What struck me most was how much of what was happening relied on my silence. Not consent, silence. The plans at home weren't built on agreement or open discussion. They were built on the assumption that I wouldn't ask, wouldn't challenge, wouldn't be believed if I did. That realization made everything sharper. It wasn't just betrayal, it was strategy. Then came the pressure. It started subtly, suggestions disguised as advice, warnings framed as concern. I was told certain paths were too risky, certain choices not realistic, certain ambitions better left for later. Every conversation funneled to the same outcome, even though no one ever said it outright. They wanted me contained. There was one evening that confirmed everything for me. We were sitting together, the television on, but no one really watching. Someone mentioned a future event again, something that directly involved me. I asked a simple question, calm, neutral, almost innocent. What does that mean for me? The silence that followed was instant and heavy. No one answered right away. They exchanged looks, quick and practiced, like people who had rehearsed responses but hadn't expected to need them so soon. Finally, one person spoke, dismissing my question with a vague explanation and a soft laugh, as if I'd misunderstood something obvious. I didn't push, but inside, something clicked into place. They weren't prepared for direct questions. They were prepared for obedience. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to expose them emotionally or dramatically. I wasn't going to confront them at the dinner table or demand explanations. That would only turn this into a battle of authority, and I already knew how that would end. Instead, I focused on timing. Over the next few days, I carefully positioned myself in conversations with adults outside the house, teachers, counselors, people who had a responsibility to listen. I didn't accuse, I didn't speculate. I simply asked about processes, about safeguards, about what should happen when decisions affected someone directly. Every answer reinforced the same thing. What was happening at home wasn't appropriate, and it wasn't sustainable. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One afternoon, I was called into the school office. Not urgently, not dramatically, just calmly asked to sit down. The counselor was there, along with another adult whose role I recognized immediately, someone with authority, someone neutral. They explained that concerns had been raised, not accusations, but questions. Questions about communication, consent, and involvement. They asked me how I felt about certain decisions being discussed. I told the truth. Not emotionally, not angrily. I spoke slowly, carefully, choosing words that couldn't be twisted. I explained how I had discovered that conversations were happening without me, how I felt excluded, and how I believed information was intentionally withheld. No names were mentioned, no dramatic reveals, but the silence in that room told me everything. They believed me. Later that day, I came home to a house that felt different in a way I couldn't ignore. The tension was sharper now, more frantic. Someone asked how my day had been with forced casualness. Another avoided me entirely. They knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. That evening, the person I trusted, the one whose name I had overheard, finally spoke to me alone. They tried to sound calm, but their voice wavered. They asked if I'd talked to anyone, if I felt confused, if I felt misunderstood. I looked at them and answered honestly. I feel like things were decided without me. They didn't deny it. That was the moment betrayal stopped being a suspicion and became a fact. They explained themselves carefully, justifying their choices as for my own good, as temporary, as necessary. They never apologized. They never acknowledged the deception. They just wanted control back. I listened quietly, the same way I always had. When they finished, I nodded and said nothing. The relief on their face was immediate. They thought they'd fixed it, but what they didn't know was that the process had already moved beyond them, because once authority steps in, secrets lose their power. The following days unfolded slowly but inevitably. Meetings were scheduled, conversations became formal, questions were asked that couldn't be brushed aside. I was included, not as a problem, but as a participant. Watching the people who had underestimated me struggle to maintain their composure was surreal. They were polite, cooperative, but the confidence was gone. And in its place was something far more telling: fear. Not fear of punishment, fear of losing control. By the time I realized just how much had shifted, it was already too late for them to undo it. The truth was out, not loudly, not publicly, but officially, and the consequences were beginning to take shape. I went to bed one night knowing that the house I'd grown up in was no longer operating by the same rules. The power dynamics had changed. The silence they depended on was broken, and tomorrow I would see just how far the fallout would go. Because secrets don't collapse all at once. They unravel. And the final thread was already loose. And the next morning, the house felt quieter than it ever had before. Not peaceful, careful. Doors closed softly, conversations stayed brief. No one raised their voice, yet every word carried weight. The people who once moved freely now measured their steps around me, unsure of what I knew, what I might say next, or who might already be listening somewhere beyond these walls. I noticed how quickly routines changed when trust was gone. Breakfast was silent. Someone tried to make small talk, asking about school, about homework, about plans for the weekend. Their voice sounded normal, but their eyes didn't meet mine. Another person hovered nearby, pretending to tidy up, clearly waiting to hear how I would respond. I answered politely, calmly, briefly. There was no satisfaction in watching them struggle, no thrill, just a steady sense of control returning to where it belonged. Later that day, the meeting happened. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voices, no accusations thrown across the room, just adults sitting at a table, speaking carefully, formally, choosing words that could withstand scrutiny. I was there too, not as an afterthought, not as a problem to be managed, but as someone's perspective mattered. That alone felt like justice. Questions were asked about decisions that had been made without me, about conversations I hadn't been included in, about why honesty had been replaced with silence. Each question landed like a quiet weight on the people who believed they could control the narrative. They answered, slowly, defensively at first, then more honestly, once they realized denial wouldn't work. They spoke about fear, about pressure, about wanting to avoid conflict, about believing they knew what was best. No one said the word betrayal. I didn't have to, because I felt it in every explanation that avoided responsibility, in every justification that treated me like a risk instead of a person. What surprised me was how quickly authority shifted the tone. When neutral adults asked the same questions I had been discouraged from asking, the answers changed. Suddenly, vague explanations weren't enough. Suddenly, decisions had to be explained logically, not emotionally. And when they couldn't explain them, silence returned. But this time, it worked against them. By the end of the meeting, boundaries were set. Clear ones. Communication was no longer optional. Inclusion was no longer negotiable. Decisions affecting me would involve me. Period. No punishment was announced, no threats were made, but the message was unmistakable. The power to decide without accountability was gone. Walking home afterward felt strange, lighter, but also heavier in a way I couldn't quite define. I wasn't celebrating, I wasn't angry anymore either. I was processing the fact that people I had trusted had chosen convenience over honesty, and that truth had finally caught up with them. At home, things changed again. Not overnight, not perfectly, but noticeably. I was asked for my opinion, not casually, genuinely. I was informed before plans were made. Conversations happened in front of me instead of behind closed doors. When disagreements came up, they were addressed instead of avoided. The person whose voice I had recognized, the one I had trusted most, kept their distance at first. When they finally spoke to me, it wasn't to justify themselves, it was to admit they were wrong. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just quietly. "I should have told you," they said. I nodded. That was enough. Forgiveness didn't come instantly, but respect returned slowly, piece by piece, and with it came something more valuable than any apology: acknowledgement. School felt different too. I carried myself differently. Not louder, not more defiant, just steadier. Teachers noticed. Friends noticed. I wasn't reacting to things the way I used to. I wasn't shrinking to keep the peace. I had learned something that couldn't be taken away. Silence protects the people who misuse it, and questions, when asked calmly and at the right time, are powerful. Weeks passed. The situation settled. Life resumed its rhythm, but with a new awareness underneath it all. The truth had surfaced without being forced, without destroying everything in its path. That was the part I was proudest of. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't lash out. I didn't seek revenge through humiliation. I let systems do what they were designed to do. I trusted process over impulse. And in the end, that made all the difference. Sometimes I think back to the moment I pressed play, not to relive it, but to remember how quickly everything can change when you stop assuming silence is safety. The people who once believed they could decide my future without my voice learned something they hadn't expected: that I was listening, that I understood more than they thought, and that when the truth comes out quietly, it can still change everything. I didn't freeze because I was afraid. I froze because I realized I was no longer powerless. And once that realization settles in, nothing ever feels the same again.